Think about the piece of paper sitting in your safe or filing cabinet right now, your birth certificate. You probably haven't looked at it in years, but without it, your modern life instantly freezes. You can't get a driver's license. You can't get a passport. You can't open a bank account, register for school, get a social security card, or legally prove you are who you say you are. In the eyes of the government, that single piece of paper is the fundamental proof that you actually exist. But here is something that might genuinely shock you. For the first 126 years of its existence, the United States of America had no standardized federal system for issuing birth certificates. None. Zero. Zip. When George Washington was president, when Abraham Lincoln led the nation through the Civil War, and when industrial titans were building the American empire, there was no single official government document that recorded when or where an ordinary citizen was born. In fact, it wasn't until 1902 that the United States Census Bureau finally established a permanent agency to create a uniform, national framework for tracking births. And even then, it took decades for states to actually comply. So, the question isn't just a historical curiosity, it's actually kind of terrifying when you think about it. How on earth did an entire continental superpower function for over a century when millions of its citizens had zero government paperwork proving their existence? How did a farmer in Ohio prove he was old enough to buy land? How did a factory worker prove his age to get a pension? How did courts figure out who was entitled to an inheritance when a wealthy relative died? And what stopped a complete stranger from simply walking into a new town, changing his name, stealing an identity, or inventing an entirely fake life out of thin air? The answer is a fascinating, bizarre, and deeply human journey into a lost world of American history. A world where identity wasn't determined by state officials, stamps, or official seals, but by holy Bibles, church bells, notches on wooden door frames, local midwives, and the word of your next-door neighbors. It was a time when proving who you were depended entirely on whether the people in your small town remembered seeing you take your very first breath. Because here is the thing most people don't realize. The Founding Fathers didn't forget to create a birth registration system by accident. They simply lived in a radically decentralized world where the state government stayed out of your personal life and where your community was your database. But as America transformed from a quiet farming nation into a chaotic industrial powerhouse filled with crowded cities and millions of strangers, that informal system broke down completely. And the chaos that followed forced the federal government to invent the modern, documented human being. So, let me take you back to the beginning, to an era when you could live your entire life, buy property, get married, and be buried in the ground without ever holding a single piece of paper to prove you existed. Imagine you were born in a small farming village in Pennsylvania back in 1820. There was no hospital, no state vital statistics office, and no county clerk sitting in an office waiting to log your name into an official database. So, the second you entered the world, how did anyone record that you actually existed? The short answer is, they relied on God, memory, and simple household tools. For the vast majority of early Americans, the single most important legal document in their entire house wasn't a deed, a title, or a passport. It was the family Bible. Heavy, leather-bound, and prominently placed on a parlor table, the family Bible served as the unofficial central database for generations of American families. Between the Old and New Testaments, printer companies specifically bound blank, lined pages labeled Family Record. The moment a child was born, the father or mother would carefully dip a fountain pen in ink and write down the child's full name, the exact date, the hour of birth, and the town where it happened. They recorded everything in that Bible: births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths. If you ever needed to prove how old you were to settle an estate, claim an inheritance, or show you were old enough to marry, you didn't go to town hall. You literally carried your heavy family Bible into court, placed it on the judge's desk, and swore an oath that the faded ink on those pages was authentic. Courts across the country accepted these family Bible records as valid legal evidence because everyone understood it was the best record available. If a family didn't own a Bible, or if they were illiterate, they relied on local churches. In those days, religious institutions did the job that local governments refused to do. When a newborn was brought to church to be baptized, the local minister or priest recorded the child's name, parents, and date of baptism in a leather-bound church register. On the same day, the church bells would ring out across the village, a physical signal to the entire community that a new soul had entered the world. And then there were the physical markers around the home. In rural frontier communities, parents carved notches into the wooden doorframes of their log cabins to track their children's growth and birth order. Midwives made mental notes or marked down deliveries in tiny personal pocket journals. But this entire system relied on one crucial thing: staying in the same place. Your identity wasn't backed up by a central government server. It was backed up by the collective memory of your neighbors. Everyone in your town knew who your parents were, saw you grow up, and could testify under oath that you were who you claimed to be. As long as America remained a quiet, slow-moving farming society, this informal system worked well enough. But it had one massive, fatal flaw. It was extraordinarily fragile. If your house burned down and took the family Bible with it, your official life history turned to ash. If a church flooded, decades of baptismal records dissolved in the water. If your local minister passed away without keeping clean ledgers, your birth record vanished. And if you packed up your wagon and moved 500 miles west to start a new life, nobody in your new town had any idea who you were. And that's where the real trouble began. If you were a pregnant woman in the early 1800s, you didn't make an appointment at a hospital. You didn't see an obstetrician, and you didn't leave the birth room with a neatly printed birth certificate. Instead, when labor started, a family member ran down a dirt road to grab the most important person in any early American community: the local midwife. Midwives were the gatekeepers of life and death in early America. They delivered nearly every baby born on the continent, and for over a century, they held the only real records of human existence. But midwives weren't government workers. They didn't hand their notes over to a city clerk. They kept private, handwritten journals, tiny leather pocketbooks where they scribbled down every delivery they performed, along with the date, the parents' names, the baby's gender, and whatever fee they were paid, whether it was $2 cash, a dozen eggs, or a sack of flour. If you were born in a quiet village, the only paper trail proving your arrival on Earth might be a single, ink-smudged line in a midwife's personal diary. If that midwife retired, moved away, or dropped her journal into a fireplace, your birth record vanished forever. Now, some states did try to fix this. Colonies like Massachusetts had passed laws as far back as the 1600s, telling local town clerks to record births, marriages, and deaths in official municipal books. But here was the problem. Almost nobody followed these laws. Town clerks were overworked and underpaid. They treated birth tracking as an annoying side task. If a busy farmer forgot to ride into town to tell the clerk his wife had given birth, the birth simply never got recorded. There were no fines, no enforcement, and no standardized forms. In many counties, clerks only recorded births if the parents specifically walked into their office and paid a fee. If you were poor, you simply didn't bother. This patchwork system created a bizarre reality across 19th century America. It meant that your ability to prove your existence depended entirely on where you happened to live. A child born in Boston might have his birth recorded in a neat city ledger, while a child born 20 miles away in a rural township existed only in his mother's memory and a midwife's pocketbook. And this lack of paper trail opened up a massive loophole that thousands of people exploited every single day: identity fraud. In early America, starting a new life was shockingly easy. If you got into deep debt, committed a crime, ran away from an apprenticeship, or simply hated your spouse, you didn't need to fake documents or forge a passport. You just packed a bag, walked to the next state, and changed your name. There were no background checks, no driver's licenses, and no birth certificates to check against. You could show up in a new town, tell everyone your name was John Smith, invent a birth date, make up a hometown, and nobody could prove you were lying. You became a completely new person instantly. America was a nation filled with human ghosts, people walking around with zero official proof of who they were or where they came from. And as long as the country remained mostly rural, society tolerated the chaos. But as the 19th century drew to a close, a massive transformation was coming that would blow this informal system wide open. By the late 1800s, the quiet, agricultural America of small towns and family Bibles was rapidly evaporating. The Industrial Revolution was screaming into full gear. Factories were springing up across the country, roaring with heavy machinery, and millions of people were pouring into massive, overcrowded cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. At the same time, steamships were bringing millions of immigrants across the Atlantic from Europe, all looking for work in this booming new economy. Almost overnight, America transformed from a nation of small, tight-knit farming villages where everyone knew your grandfather into a chaotic wilderness of booming industrial cities filled with total strangers. And this is where the old, informal system of proving who you were completely shattered. In a city of 2 million people, a judge couldn't ask your next-door neighbor if they remembered the day you were born. A factory owner couldn't look at a family Bible brought in by a worker from another state. The intimate, community-based trust that had held American society together for over a century simply ceased to function. And without official birth certificates to verify age and identity, American society descended into a nightmare of fraud, exploitation, and institutional chaos. The most horrific consequence of this undocumented world was child labor. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, factory owners, textile mills, and coal mines routinely hired young children to work grueling 12-hour shifts in incredibly dangerous conditions. States eventually began passing laws banning children under the age of 14 from working. But factory owners easily bypassed these laws because there was no way to prove how old a child actually was. Parents who desperately needed money would lie and claim their 9-year-old child was 14. Factory managers turned a blind eye, knowing the government had zero paperwork to inspect. Without a state-issued birth certificate proving a child's age, inspectors stood completely helpless while hundreds of thousands of young children were swallowed up by dangerous industrial machinery. It didn't stop there. Marriage fraud and bigamy swept through major cities. A man could marry a woman in Boston, abandon her and his children 3 years later, move to Chicago, adopt an alias, and marry someone else. Without central records or birth identity tracking, nobody could track his past. Military recruitment suffered from the same structural blindness. During national calls to arms, men lied about their age to enlist, while draft dodgers claimed they were too young or too old, leaving officers scrambling to guess a recruit's age simply by looking at his face or teeth. And then came the financial wars over pensions and inheritances. When wealthy land barons or Civil War veterans passed away, phantom heirs materialized out of nowhere, claiming to be long-lost sons or daughters born in distant counties. Courts were clogged with endless, bitter lawsuits, where fraudsters presented forged family Bible pages or paid fake witnesses to lie under oath about birth dates. The United States government was spending millions of dollars paying out Civil War pensions, but without birth records, pension officers were constantly paying money to fraudsters who were nowhere near the age required for eligibility. America had built the most powerful industrial economy on Earth, but its legal foundation was built on quicksand. The nation was operating entirely in the dark, unable to control its workforce, protect its children, or verify the identities of its own citizens. Something fundamental had to give. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States government realized it was running a superpower completely blind. Public health officials had no idea how many babies were being born or dying each year. School districts couldn't enforce mandatory education laws because they couldn't verify student ages. Factory inspectors were powerless against child labor, and courts were drowning in identity fraud. The turning point finally arrived in 1902. Congress officially established the United States Census Bureau as a permanent federal agency. For the first time in history, Washington stepped in to fix the nation's chaotic vital statistics problem. In 1907, working alongside public health organizations, the Census Bureau published the Model State Vital Statistics Act. This was a standardized template given to every state, outlining how to record human life. The government created a universal, standard birth certificate form. It required specific medical and legal facts, the baby's full name, exact date and time of birth, precise location, gender, parents' names, occupations, and crucially, the signature of the attending physician or certified midwife. However, turning this new template into reality was a total administrative nightmare. The federal government didn't have the constitutional authority to force state legislatures to collect birth records. Each state had to pass its own laws, set up its own Bureau of Vital Statistics, and build an entire system from absolute scratch. States resisted. Local doctors complained about filling out extra government paperwork, and rural citizens deeply distrusted the government prying into their private lives. In 1900, only 10 states and a handful of major cities met basic federal standards for recording births. It took nearly 3 decades of relentless political pressure, public health campaigns, and legal reforms before every state joined what was called the birth registration area. Georgia became the last state to finally enter the fold in 1933. Then, just as the system was getting established, a massive national crisis struck that caught millions of older Americans completely off guard: the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt created Social Security, millions of aging workers rushed to apply for their retirement benefits. But there was a massive catch. To get your monthly pension check, you had to legally prove your exact date of birth to show you were 65 years old. The problem? Millions of working-class Americans applying for Social Security had been born before 1902, long before state birth certificates existed. Overnight, an entire generation of elderly citizens discovered they were officially invisible on paper. Panic swept across the nation. The federal government was suddenly flooded with millions of frantic requests from older citizens desperate to prove they existed. People embarked on wild scavenger hunts, hunting down 70-year-old family Bibles, searching through dusty, crumbling church registers, and tracking down old baptismal records. They pulled decades-old school census lists, located hospital ledger fragments, and found elderly childhood neighbors willing to sign sworn affidavits testifying to the day they were born. To handle this massive national identity crisis, states began issuing what were called delayed birth certificates, official government documents created retroactively using whatever scraps of historic evidence citizens could dig up. By the time World War II erupted in the 1940s, birth certificates were no longer just an administrative detail. Defense factories required birth certificates to prevent foreign spies from entering war manufacturing plants. For the first time in American history, an official birth certificate was the mandatory key to getting a job, securing government benefits, and living as a recognized citizen. The documented human being had finally arrived. When you zoom out and look at this massive transformation, you realize something profound about how the world actually works. The journey from a handwritten entry in a dusty family Bible to a security-embossed, state-stamped birth certificate wasn't just a simple upgrade in record-keeping. It was a complete overhaul of how human society functions. For the first century of American history, your existence was anchored in your physical community. You didn't need a government agency to validate your life, because the people around you, your family, your neighbors, your minister, your local midwife, knew your story from the day you took your very first breath. Your identity was biological, local, and organic. Today, that dynamic has completely inverted. We live in a world where your physical presence means virtually nothing without state-sanctioned documentation. Think about it. You can stand right in front of a government official or a border agent, but without that paper birth certificate, or the digital database entry, social security number, driver's license, and real ID that spring from it, you are effectively invisible to the modern world. You cannot work, travel, own property, or access your own money. The birth certificate became the foundational master key for the modern bureaucratic state. It transformed a chaotic nation of self-reliant, undocumented individuals into an organized society of legible, trackable citizens. It brought an end to runaway identity fraud, helped eradicate the horrors of child labor, and built the legal security needed to run the world's most complex economy. And today, we are watching that exact same evolutionary step happen all over again. Just as paper birth certificates replaced family Bibles during the chaos of the Industrial Revolution, our physical documents are now being replaced by digital identities, biometric scanning, and encrypted databases. The paper certificate sitting in your safe is slowly migrating into the cloud, turning your physical identity into algorithms and digital records. The next time you pull out your birth certificate to renew your passport or sign a contract, take a second to look at that official state seal and watermarked paper. Remember that for the first 126 years of American history, that simple piece of paper didn't exist. Millions of people built an entire empire completely off the grid, verified only by the word of their neighbors, the chime of church bells, and faded ink on the pages of a family Bible. It is a striking reminder that the systems we take for granted every single day are surprisingly young, fragile, and built out of pure necessity. If this story shifted your perspective on how our modern world was actually built, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. We go deep into these hidden structural stories, the ones that shape your daily life in ways you never think about. And if you want to keep exploring how power, money, and control really work behind the scenes, click on the next video appearing on your screen right now. You definitely don't want to miss it.